Thank you. I first of all apologise for my voice isn't quite right, so I hope you can all hear me, but please shout at the back if you can't hear what I'm saying. So I'm going to talk about scale in contemporary art, and I'm going to start with this artwork. So in 2008, the British artist Mark Wallinger created a new sculpture which had been commissioned by Magdalen College, Oxford.
Do we have lights down?
Yeah, that's a great idea, thank you. Is that okay? Yeah. So it's positioned in an orchard in Magdalen College, and the work is a steel structure, 10 metres high and wide. And from the side, the artwork almost appears to disappear because it's so thin. But when viewed square on, the sculpture resembles the trees that surround it. And its central trunk and branches out into a series of smaller and smaller versions of itself. So that within this fractal pattern, another image and you can see it perhaps more clearly. Within this fractal pattern, each branch becomes a kind of mini echo of its parent form. Now, Wallinger titled the artwork Y, as in spelled in the letter of the alphabet. I'll go back and you can see the title there. So this naming, like the sculpture itself, relates to multiple references simultaneously. Y is obviously a letter suggesting verbal and written communication. It's also used within algebra as a signal of an as yet unknown quantity. And its homophone, Y, can be an existential question, a philosophical line of inquiry, or perhaps a kind of desperate, open-ended question signalling a desire for and a lack of understanding. So I would argue then that the title acts similarly to the fractal pattern of the tree. The same signifier emerges at different scales, offering different registers of an acknowledgement of the unknown. And further, the structure of the artwork suggests that one reference begets the next, so that these questions of why grow naturally out of each other. Also, I think, highlighting the connectedness of interdisciplinary thought. And this is, of course, an eminently desirable idea to position within the heart of an interdisciplinary university college. So the sculpture fulfills a task of connecting different subject areas to a single contemporary artwork. And college professors, including Robert Douglas Fairhurst, have noted other more playful resonances within the artwork and the college. So the Y structure also, according to Douglas Fairhurst, mirrors the antlers of the deer that are local to Magdalen. And the artist, Wallinger himself, has talked about a kind of formal synergy between the sculpture's shape and the traceries of the college's stained glass windows. But most prominently, I think, Y holds its kind of visual, mathematical, philosophical, perhaps theological questioning as its root and branches, if you like. So its fractal pattern suggests that each thematic referent is a differently scaled version of itself. So in my talk today, I want to explore the ways in which contemporary artists have used scale within their work as a means of questioning. I want to suggest that at the heart of recent artistic investigations into scale is this recurrent question about meaning, a kind of recurring why. By looking at a range of artworks made over the past few decades and their relation to key modern artworks from the 20th century, I want to argue that scale emerges as a tool which artists have used in order to question the production, the presentation, and even the possibility of meaning. So the role and indeed the definition of scale within art has long been a matter of debate. So while size might be an inherent aspect of almost all artwork, perhaps some conceptual artwork without extension might be an exception to that. But scale is an under-examined but crucial aspect of art. So in my research, I've noted the different ways scale as a term has been used, and I'll just sketch some of those out very briefly here. So Henry Moore, for example, identified scale as a sense of a kind of innately monumental, desirable trait of what he thought of as successful artworks. That's one understanding of scale. In contrast, the anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss suggested that all artwork is fundamentally a miniaturization. All of it is, in some sense, a small-scale representation of some aspect of the existing world, according to Levi-Strauss. In the 1960s, the minimalist artist Robert Morris foregrounded a bodily phenomenological approach to scale, suggesting that scale in an artwork is the result of an essentially triangular relationship between the art object, the viewer's body, and the space in between. And that kind of focus has held some sway. The art critic James Mayer, writing much later in 2004, referred to that kind of definition of scale when he mourned a rash of what he thought of as outsized artworks that had happened in recent years up to the millennium. These were housed in fairly new, enormous galleries to contemporary art. And for Mayer, that meant that there was now no more scale. He thinks the calibrated relation, as he calls it, between viewer and artwork within modernism had given way to a contemporary practice, which we're living through, which Mayer thought was untethered from both phenomenology and criticality. So that's just a very brief summary of some descriptions of scale, but each of these approaches towards defining scale in art, despite their variety, all share, I think, a desire to apply value judgment towards scale. They all suggest that it's superior to size, for a start, and frequently it's presented as something that's almost rather mystical, that's a kind of aspect of an artwork to be sought out and praised. The artist Robert Smithson offered one such definition. I'll come back to this, is perhaps his most famous work. He said, "Size determines an object, scale determines art. A crack in the wall, if viewed in terms of scale, not size, could be called the Grand Canyon. A room could be made to take on the immensity of the solar system. Scale depends on one's capacity to be conscious of the actualities of perception." Now, as I say, for Smithson, this thinking arises from his writing about his artwork, Spiral Jetty, which is this huge earthwork in Salt Lake City. Particularly, he's interested in scale in relation to the fractal nature of this work. It's not a term that he uses, but it arises from his discussion of it. So Smithson wrote, "Each cubic salt crystal echoes the spiral jetty in terms of the crystal's molecular lattice. Growth in a crystal advances around a dislocation point in the manner of a screw. The spiral jetty could be considered one layer within a spiraling crystal lattice, magnified trillions of times." So for Smithson, as he writes about this fractal patterning of the spiral jetty is limited to its structure, not to its perception by viewers. And so while the crystal pattern that he talks about repeats at different scales within the artwork, viewers are free to view qualitatively different objects as related through scale in his previous quote that I gave you. So a crack in the wall could be viewed as the Grand Canyon, or a room could appear as immense as a solar system. So that line of thought extends beyond a consideration of a more kind of tight fractal repetition then, towards a definition of scale in art, which is, I think, fascinatingly dependent upon the power and foibles of individual perception. It's almost reminiscent of Hamlet's lines, I think. Hamlet famously says he could be bounded within a nutshell and count himself king of infinite space. And Smithson suggests that scale here is a matter of belief, whether accurate or not. And he notes that scale operates by uncertainty, he says, which is obviously a state in which belief is enabled. So it's as if scale's relationality engenders a form of philosophical relativism here. To quote Hamlet again, this idea that there is nothing good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. So already then, scale is envisaged as offering a means of questioning, here in terms of the reliability of one's own perception. In my own writing about scale, I've argued for a definition which aligns size with the qualitative and scale with the quantitative. And this was in part due to my focus on the period since the 1990s, when many artists, especially sculptors, were producing work which explored proportional relations of scale, including enlargements, miniaturizations, and life-size works. Obviously, Elizabeth's work is particularly important here. I'll give you some images of other examples that I've looked at in my work. So Mona Hartoum, for example, made quite a few enlargements of kitchen utensils so that they become these kind of unnervingly hostile, dangerous, divisive objects, and also quite humorous. And it's an interesting play of that kind of feeling of threat and of humour. So she's made a giant cheese grater, various kind of domestic objects that are often considered to be sort of traditionally to be considered within the feminine domain, that she makes kind of unhomely or kind of a surreal element of fear, but they are scaled up. This is a kind of metre by half a metre, to the point where it could be there not for an egg, but for a human. Humour continues. So Maurizio Cattelan made this knowingly miniaturised self-portrait, which allows him to position himself amongst the library canon of great artists. So you can see he's been able to fit himself in here alongside Gerhard Richter, Anish Kapoor, Gilbert and George, that kind of thing. Ron Muick consistently used a kind of hyper-realism in terms of his enlargements and miniaturizations, often to communicate a kind of expression of psychological or emotional state. You can get a sense of the scale change here, but he often did much more extreme enlargements or miniaturizations. One might think of Akiko Masaka Takada's transformation of small everyday objects into miniaturized versions of much larger ones. Here there's a tiny section of brick that was missing that they filled in with much smaller bricks. Now, I've argued that all of these three-dimensional works from the 1990s onwards have art historical roots in preceding movements, including surrealism, as I mentioned with Mona Hatoum, with its favouring of a bizarre conflation of scales, and pop with its reflection of the kind of eye-catching scale shifts of advertising. So some key precedents we might think of include the work of Salvador Dali and Edward James. This is their Mae West Lip Sofa from 1938. And Kleist Oldenburg's whimsical kind of monumentalizing of small everyday objects. So this is his clothespin work in Philadelphia in America. Much of this artwork, I argue, presents a recurring fascination with photography and its relation to the three-dimensional, as Elizabeth's work is so adept at investigating. And it's also worth noting that much of this alteration of scale can also be linked back to key works of literature. And Susan Stewart's book on longing addresses this kind of idea, including looking at satirical works, how scale has been used in satire, particularly through texts like Gulliver's Travels, and also children's literature, from Alice in Wonderland to kind of Tom Thumb. But what emerges from a brief scan of this artistic trend is certainly the variety of subject matter that scale is used to address. In my book, I note the main themes that scale has been deployed in examining in this work since the 1990s. And it spans from addressing issues of control and power and agency to those of humour, excess, and often the fallibility of perception. In particular, I've argued more recently that the life-size kind of one-to-one scale works have frequently been used by artists to explore overtly politicised questions of loss. But what I want to focus on today is, in part, the relation that this artistic trend has to the theoretical writing of the time. Because during the 1990s, as theories of postmodernism were still flourishing, ideas about the disintegration of both scale and distance were rife. So Marc Auger, writing an introduction to an anthropology of supermodernity, he called it, in 1992, stated, "We live in an era characterized by changes of scale, in which we can now only cope with the near and the elsewhere." And Paul Virilio diagnosed a pollution of distances, he called it, in his book Open Sky in 1995, in which he declared that the life size was rapidly eroding. And this is in part due to his interest in technology. He thinks there's a kind of horizon line that has kind of disappeared with our gradual encroachment of screens. So for both Auger and Virilio, these changes are a direct result of advances in technology, particularly the development of real-time television and ever faster modes of transport. These technologies, they argued, altered our sense of the relation between space and time, apparently compressing our impression of distance. So our understanding of scale is also altered. And I've mentioned a few French philosophers there, but there are also work going on in this field in terms of geography. So the geographer David Harvey wrote a very important text about postmodernism, talking about a kind of effect of time-space compression, which he links to capitalism, but leads to the same ultimate idea that our sense of scale is almost under attack. And so that's one area of debate at the time. as well as those theories that we're losing a sense of scale because of these technological developments, there were also theories at the time suggesting that measurement itself was increasingly meaningless. So in the 1960s and 70s, which is when we also see some American precedents to the 90s trend for enlargement and miniaturization, such as Oldenburg. In the 60s and 70s, artists and writers were questioning the very usefulness of measurement. The French artist Robert Filliou neatly summed up his ideas about measurement in visual terms through this artwork. This is 8 measurement poems in which he's positioned rulers of various lengths leaning against the gallery wall, divided not into centimetres or inches, but by shoe insoles or other everyday objects. There's some representation of whistles, some Batman stickers. And what I think Filliou is doing here is questioning the units of measurements that we use, and in doing that, suggesting an essential detachment, perhaps, between a system of measurement and that which is measured. So if you give the units of measurement almost equal emphasis to that which they are being quantitatively compared, then as with metaphor in language, something is something else, which in essence it is not. A man is 6 feet, or to quote one of Filliou's poems, a metre might be 10 whistles. Indeed, the art historian T.J. Clark has suggested that scale can be defined precisely by its metaphorical nature. So for Clark, he argues that size is always literal. Size is, quote, a matter of actual physical intuition, whereas scale is unabashedly metaphorical. And I think we can see that trait even in the Robert Smithson short statement I quoted earlier. This idea of the relational aspect of scale, its reliance upon comparison and measurement, lends itself to a metaphorical approach where one thing is seen as something it's not. So a crack could be a canyon. And so Filliou's measurement poems makes this point visually with great concision. And it's interesting, I think, that he should title it as a poem. It further suggests the kind of metaphorical aspect of measurement itself. And it suggests an inherent disconnection between the unit of measurement used and the measured object itself, perhaps suggesting that all measurement is a form of poetry, implying perhaps that standard units of measurement are just the kind of dead metaphors, which, like all language, according to Nietzsche, lose all recognition of their metaphorical status through repeated use. So, rather than appreciating the poetic status of measurement, however, some of Filliou's contemporaries suggested a dissatisfaction with what they saw as the arbitrary quality of the relationship between measurement and meaning. The artist Mel Bochner made a series of artworks mocking the capacities of measurement and wrote about it as if it was a form of solipsism. So Bochner wrote, "Measurement is one of our means of believing that the world can be reduced to a function of human understanding. Yet when forced to surrender its transparency, measurement reveals an essential nothingness. The yardstick does not say that the thing we are measuring is 1 yard long. Something must be added to the yardstick in order to assert anything about the length of the object. This is a purely mental act, an assumption." And he seems really frustrated with this idea that it's a mental act, that something is needed on the part of a person to attach, to connect the measurement with the measured. Elsewhere, he says, "Measurement is a signifier with nothing to signify." So this essential distrust of measurement extended, I think, into later theories of postmodernism in the 70s and 80s, in which writers argued that we needed to accept the limits of measurement, and in particular that we should accept the incommensurable, things that should not, or certainly could not, be measured against each other. And the most celebrated of these writers, Jean-François Lyotard, famously used his own interpretation of what he called postmodern science to claim the redundancy of grand narratives, which relied upon a kind of stable viewpoint from which to measure. And Lyotard is quite open in his acceptance that he's not a scientist, but this is his understanding of what he calls postmodern science, and he uses it to sort of fuel his theoretical writing. So in his 1979 book, The Postmodern Condition, Lyotard argues that work in maths and science, and he includes in that quantum theory, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and René Thom's catastrophe theory, all of these aspects of maths, he says, point towards a search for instabilities, which he argued questioned the very possibility of precise measurement. So for Lyotard, the utopian hope was, with his thinking, that postmodern theory encouraged an acceptance of measurement's limitations, and therefore a toleration of the incommensurable, which could have very practical real-world effects in terms of refining our sensitivity to difference. So it becomes a kind of utopian idea. In its most extreme form, however, this kind of postmodern thinking led other writers, including Jean Baudrillard in the 1980s and 90s, to claim that there had been no real to be measured in the first place. Baudrillard argues that if we can only understand anything by comparing it to something else, if we lose this ability to measure against, then we therefore also lose the ability to ascribe meaning to anything. And as an example of this condition, Baudrillard quotes a short fable by the Spanish writer Jorge Luis Borges entitled Upon Exactitude in Science. I'll just read you the quote because this paragraph is the whole text. He says, "In that empire, the craft of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province covered the space of an entire city, and the map of the empire itself an entire province. In the course of time, these extensive maps were found somehow wanting, and so the College of Cartographers evolved a map of the empire that was of the same scale as the empire, and that coincided with it point for point. Less attentive to the study of cartography, succeeding generations came to judge a map of such magnitude as cumbersome, and not without irreverence, they abandoned it to the rigours of sun and rain. In the western deserts, tattered fragments of the map are still to be found, sheltering an occasional beast or beggar. In the whole nation, no other relic is left of the discipline of cartography." So this text makes up one of Borges' most famous fables, in which you have this kind of mythical pursuit of cartography beyond scalar difference, which carries with it a form of a hallowed warning as to the uselessness and folly of such an endeavour. And it's become a very famous text, has been much quoted, but was invoked by Baudrillard in particular as a kind of neat summary of the losses due to what he diagnosed as hyperreality, this condition he thought we were living in. So hyperreality, which Baudrillard wrote about as being pervasive in the 1980s, is dominated by what he called simulacra, which is a very kind of brief summary, means a kind of copy without an original. And Borges' fable of the map, which becomes of equal size to the territory that it depicts, becomes Baudrillard's key means of explaining this postmodern position in which the real has become representation. So unlike the fable, Baudrillard claims not now that the map sort of equals the territory, but rather that the real itself has become produced. As such, the ability to measure against has been lost. So scale becomes a metaphor for comparison and its enabling of value and meaning. And in Baudrillard's philosophical position, both scale and meaning have been lost. And this idea leads to some extreme and controversial endpoints. So Baudrillard was heavily criticised for his later 1983 book entitled The Gulf War Did Not Exist, as you can imagine, which demonstrates the dangers of his rather nihilistic position. But within this climate then, and these ideas that were being discussed, I think it's all the more interesting that this artistic trend of scale has developed. And what I want to suggest is that this trend of enlargement and miniaturization and life-size work in particular, in some way fights back against these ideas of a loss of scale and a corresponding loss of meaning. So as well as using scale to reference particular issues, which I mentioned before, like emotional expression, issues of power or control, of humour and of distance, this artwork builds beyond this, I think, as a trend to a wider presentation of a signalling of a connection between measurement and meaning. This kind of proportional use of scale that you see in works like these, for example, presents an interest in a constant, in a stable point against which to measure, which was exactly what some of these postmodern theorists were claiming had been lost. And we can see a continuation of this interest in scale as a means of communicating meaning in more recent artwork as well. So scale has been used particularly clearly to convey contemporary artistic preoccupations in recent years, I think, including responses to conflict, legacies of cultural loss, and concerns about ecology. So I just want to spend the rest of my talk focusing on a few contemporary artists whose work uses scale in order to address these kinds of issues through the form of both the poem and the map. So Sophie Risselhuber's Faye from 1992 is a photographic installation comprising of 71 different photographs taken by the artist in Kuwait months after the end of the First Gulf War. And the images are all exhibited at the same size, so they're 40 by 50 inches each, and they're arranged differently in different galleries to suit the space of the particular institution in which they're shown. And Risselhuber's photographs vary from aerial views captured in helicopters and planes to ground views, capturing what she has called the wounds of the landscape. And what becomes immediately apparent to the viewer is the confusion of scale which these frame squares from different distances present. So Risselhuber herself has commented that the photographs, she says, they move from the infinitely large to the infinitely small, so we lose a sense of scale. And in that way, the artwork is deliberately disorientating then, and could be read perhaps as an accompaniment to the theorizations of the loss of scale, which I've been discussing. Yet accompanying this dizzying lack of stable positioning, Risselhuber entitles her work Fait, which can be translated from the French both as the English word fact, but also in the sense of what has been done. I'll give you another example of it there. So contrary to Baudrillard's denial of the stability that enables measurement and meaning, Risselhuber's title evokes something concrete and intractable and definite or set. And in part, this focus upon fact is connected to Risselhuber's use of photography. While some critics have argued that Risselhuber's aftermath photography, as they have called it, fails to show the impact or specificity of the war, it's one critique that's been levelled at this work. She's described her artwork as not being about conflict, but as a work about our scars. And Risselhuber's use of the metaphor of scars is interesting, in particular in relation to indexical marks, physical traces, and that's particularly resonant with the history of photography, of course, which is seen as an indexical medium, recording a physical trace of the object or subject in front of the camera. It's that very indexicality that led early inventors of photography to treat the medium as though it was a vehicle of truth, a revealer of facts. So while facts may be destabilized by the kind of fragmented islands of determinism and the resulting uncertainty that Lyotard put forward in the postmodern condition, here Risselhuber suggests that these scars of war are fact, they exist, it has been done. And beyond this photographic statement of presence, Risselhuber's disruption of a sense of scale also presents a rather different view of these scars of war. So the artist has discussed how the project started when she saw a thumbnail-sized image of an aerial view of the Kuwaiti desert in Time magazine, and it instantly reminded her of this artwork. This is a piece by Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp called Dust Breeding from 1920. So this work is a photograph of the dusty surface of Duchamp's famous artwork, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even, which he had deliberately left uncovered while he went away and spent a year in New York. And as the critic Mark Mayer has noted, the connection between dust breeding and Faye, this is Risselhuber's work because of dust breeding, showing the kind of visual connection she saw. So Mark Mayer has noted this connection between dust breeding and Faye and thinks it consists not only in the kind of static longevity of the photograph that outlives its changing subject matter, but also as an interest in human mark making. As such, Faye is a reminder that war is as deliberate as mark making, while also questioning the ethics of aestheticizing violence. And her play with scale here highlights how, in Smithson's words, a crack can become a canyon, and different elements of scale can easily be misrepresented. It also presents the dangers of this, I think, of ignoring or mismatching scales. This was one of the first conflicts in which views of aerial warfare were transmitted back home to the West. And Risselhuber's deliberate mix of distant and close-up views reveals the way in which the impacts of war can be sanitized by distance, and that scale has an important function not only in modern warfare but also in its representation. So Mayer argues that Risselhuber has never forced meaning upon her examples, but meaning emerges nevertheless as if she were a good poet. And there's this idea that there's a kind of metaphorical functioning of scale here that's being used in relation to the kind of factuality of the scarred landscape in order to pose these questions about the ethics of aerial warfare and its lasting effects. Now, decades before Risselhuber's project, the Japanese photographer Kikuji Kawada used scale to focus upon the factual aftermath of war as well. Kawada made a book of photographs entitled The Map in 1965, which was released 20 years to the day after the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And the map consists of many black and white photographs of scenes from the site, including the atomic bomb dome that was close to the centre of the explosion. And the book, as you can see it here, it's specially designed as a series of unfolding pages, so that when shown in galleries, it appears as this kind of sculptural zigzag form of dense black and white images. Like Risselhuber's work, Kawada's images also operate mostly in tight focus, so they offer close-ups of scraps, of bloodstains, destroyed surfaces, and in one image, a crumpled black and white Japanese flag. So Kawada, like Risselhuber, has chosen to eschew the context offered by a wide-angle shot with the inclusion of a horizon line. And the result is, I think, as with Fay, an abstraction of the scene, so that the factual nature of the photograph, while present as an act of showing or pointing, nevertheless appears mysterious and crucially unreadable, despite his entitlement of it as a map. So here the close-up reveals something of the horror and the horror and suffering of the explosion, while also suggesting, perhaps, that the full repercussions are too extensive to contain within the camera frame. So faced with the history of such a terrible event, there is no possibility of stepping far enough back to view it clearly. It cannot be taken in, and so the close-up and its constraints are the only vision possible. At the start of Kawada's book, there is a poem written at the opening. I'll just read it out to you. It says, "I saw a map close to my wounded eyes. While it was nothing but a little piece of ground stained with heavy oil, it really appeared to me like a map of the world, full of violence in which I was to live thenceforth." So here the map, far from being a sort of ever-enlarging, more meaningless cartography project, as in Borges's tale, is a tiny piece of ground, which close-up takes on the meaning, and here the horror, of a larger scaled map. So the piece of earth, like Phileas' units of measurement, becomes something else. It becomes a metaphor for the whole. The ground becomes a miniaturized form of the earth's larger violence, seen through wounded eyes as a shift not only in geographical scales, but also in temporal ones, as the future is pictured through it. This is the violence in which I was to live thenceforth. So scale change here is not only inherent within the map as a mark of a larger territory, but also inherent in the wider meaning of the map in terms of the temporality of personal experience. And I want to close with a brief consideration of a more recent exhibition by the artist Pierre Abad, whose artwork also considers loss through a use of scale and its relation to both poetry and mapping. So Abad has an exhibition on at the moment in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And one of the first artworks that you encounter when you enter this exhibition is this one, which is entitled, so there's somebody standing in front of it, but that's to give you a sense of scale as you walk in. So this artwork, this very detailed red line drawing that you can see there, is entitled, "I am singing a song that can only be born after losing a country." It's made in 2023. So this large, delicate line drawing is a one-to-one scale drawing of the underside of an object held within the Ashmolean's collection. The Ashmolean has this object on display. It's Powhatan's mantle from the early 1600s. The mantle is described by the museum as a monumental deer hide hanging with precise shell beadwork ornaments that dates to the first period of contact between indigenous North American peoples and British colonists. It's thought to have belonged to the paramount chief of the Powhatan people, who is also known to be the father of Pocahontas. And Abad's work has consistently focused upon issues of cultural loss, particularly in relation to the history of colonialism. And in this work, he uses both one-to-one scale and a sense of miniaturization of a map to signify, I think, both the sort of majestic significance of the mantle and its current state far from home. So this is just a close-up image of his drawing. As his fine red lines tracing the intricacies of the deer's body become readable as the depictions of a landscape, Abad's work reflects this deep interconnection of land and lives, which was ruptured by colonialism. And he's talked about this work himself and has said, in the drawing, the mantle is reversed and reimagined as a map, its cracked sutures becoming bleeding borders, and the parched creases of the deer hide transforming into flowing tributaries. It is not a map of any specific place, but an atlas for the many stolen lands that cannot be recovered. So the scalar difference between map and territory, based upon the comparison which enables meaning, allows this poetic reimagining of the mantle as an atlas of loss. So like Rysselhuber and Kawada, Abad combines different scales within his work. And these kind of wounded, threading red lines can be read as the intricacies of blood vessels and the breadth of rivers and mountain ranges. This conflation of scales within the piece leads the curator Lena Fritsch to describe Abad's drawing as both indexical and abstract. She suggests it recalls microscopic images of plants, as well as aerial views of snowy landscapes and topographical illustrations that communicate spatial information. So within Abad's exhibition, this conflation of different scales becomes temporal as well as geographical, as it did for Kawada. And this is made particularly clear in his choice of epigrams for his essay in the accompanying exhibition catalogue. So there's a book accompanying the exhibition, and Abad has written his own essay within it. And notably, at the very start of that essay, he chose to quote the same fable as Baudrillard did. He quotes On Exactitude and Science by Borges in order to explain his part of his thinking, his process. So while Baudrillard, as I said, uses this fable to explain his diagnosis of a simulacra-ridden condition of hyperreality, Abad's use of the Borges quotation signals a highly contrasting approach to scale and questions of meaning than that of Baudrillard. I haven't got time to read through the quote again, but it's interesting to do so because it's not just the question of scale that Abad is interested in here from the Borges fable, but specifically the use of the word empire. So unlike Baudrillard, Abad reads the cartographer's insatiable enlarging of the map as an imperial project. So the implication is that empire does not simply seize or take over territory, but tries to remake it according to its own rules of representation. And the erasure of scalar difference between map and mapped within the fable becomes a sign of the erasure of indigenous specificity and existence. So the one-to-one scale used in Abad's artwork is not between map and territory then, with its accompanying futility and nihilism, as it was for Baudrillard, but between map and Powhatan's mantle, this symbol of leadership over a particular culture. So the mantle is thus reconfigured as a reinsertion of scalar difference, of this usefulness of comparison and measurement, and the assertion of specificity, value, and meaning. So I hope that these three, go back to the artwork, these three brief discussions of uses of scale in recent artwork highlight the ways in which it has been used, not only as a formal aspect of monumental work then, as Henry Moore might have it, but as a form of serious questioning and an address of the attribution of significance and value, often in the face of conflict and loss. The metaphorical nature of scale, its insistence upon viewing one thing in terms of another, applies to these artists' poetic portrayal of the map, as the artworks question not only what the map measures, but also by and for whom it has been made. So I've argued then that scale in contemporary art has been used as a kind of poetic means of questioning. We go back to the Mark Wallinger and his why tree, neatly expressing how one why begets another, suggesting a kind of infinite questioning of the unknown. We see artists, including Rysselhuber and Abad, using scale's metaphorical structure not to pose those kind of more broad, abstract questions, but to prompt particular responses, in these cases to loss and injustice. So while it's possible to view the address of scale in contemporary art as a response to postmodern theories which were claiming the pollution of distance and the loss of a sense of scale through increasingly globalized technological development, And it's also possible, I think, and I've argued, that it's possible to view this artistic response as revealing a reliance upon comparison and measurement in the production of meaning. Recent artistic uses of scale demonstrate its ability to pose very specific questions about particular histories and their legacies. So scale then seems to offer artists both a means of thinking through theoretical questions about meaning and interpretation, but also has been increasingly used as a poetic form of mapping, guiding viewers through previously overlooked or marginalised readings of history. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have time for questions.
Thank you. I thought it was brilliant. Congratulations on such a answering the brief so well about scale. I thought that was wonderful. I particularly like the Robert Filliou, and I'll come back to that in a second. My interest was piqued when you mentioned René Thom, of course, because I have a think about, as you know, but keep that one there. That's lovely. He had this, I think he had a problematic relationship with postmodern science, this idea, with postmodernism, and this idea that he was postmodernist scientist, I've always found problematic. I think he had problems with it, I think this university gave Lacan an honorary degree, and I think René Thom wrote letters at the time saying that's not a good idea.
Oh, really?
So I think that's, but he's absolutely right in a sense that the topology that he was really good at has got nothing to do with measurement, his style of topology. It was all about shape. And so if I could just go back to your very, very first slide, if I may, because I actually have a topology question. And I'm sorry, after you've been talking about measurement all the time, there's a topology question. I think that's not a tree. I think if you look closely, I think those things sort of touch each other, and it's not dendritic, they actually touch. So this idea that you said it's at the heart of the college, and the why's at the heart of questions. I just see hearts everywhere there, you know. And you didn't say that. You said there are other interpretations. I just see a load of hearts.
It's interesting actually because it's difficult. Obviously, it's one of the things we're thinking about. I suppose is scale. It's difficult to show artworks through photography, especially sculptures. But when I saw it in person, you're absolutely right. The thing that hit me the most when you see it square on is the hearts. I don't know whether it's mathematically, technically correct to see it as a fractal patterning of hearts.
Well, there is a certain scaling of hearts. There's lots of big hearts and little hearts, and there's hearts everywhere, and it's lovely for that. You know, we all like hearts, and I like it for the hearts, not for the tree. You know,
Right.
My wife would hate it. She'd say plant a tree. You know, don't do that. But don't have a metal thing. But can we go back to the Filliou, because I didn't want to. I just have to say there's hearts there. Can you just tell me what's on those? I thought this is great. I'm going to put this in my talk. I think this is great. What are on the 8? I can see feet.
Yes, there's shoe and soles. Sorry, it's not a great image. You can find it online very easily. There's some sunglasses, I think they are, or different kinds of glasses. There's whistles. There's these kind of Batman stickers. And I think these are mouse traps on the side. So there's a variety of kind of everyday household objects.
And finally, you seem to say you'd written a book, but you didn't advertise it in your talk. So, so can you advertise it now? What is this book?
It's a book called Scale in Contemporary Sculpture.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just make a note on this tree thing? This is actually a well-known fractal, as I think you know.
Yeah.
Originally mentioned by Mandelbrot in his book. But you're right that this is slightly decomposed, or overcomposed.
Oh, fair.
So I have so in your talk you basically focused on dimensionality and scale on some physical aspect, like space, but scale happens on many different. At societal level, there is scale in a population, there is scale in a city, there is scale in many different ways, and there is scaling of time also.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you can comment on other aspects of scaling that are not specifically related to a physical dimension.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think Yeah. I mean, partly that's been my focus because I've focused on sculpture in particular, so that's been my research.
Thought about these things a lot. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting question. Thank you. I mean, I think certainly with video art or film art that unfolds over time, that's a really interesting way of thinking about scale as well that I've not really looked into much yet. And as I was trying to do with the final artworks, I think that there's ways in which pictorial aspects of scale are feeding into my current research, but it is something that thank you, that I should look into in more detail.
Yeah, and if I can comment on this, there is also, I mean, you mentioned this postmodern science kind of critique, but modern science has a whole kind of field of complexity and complex system that is not the deterministic things that you want. I mean, that these artists might have understood at that time. So there is a completely different way of looking at, you know, emergence in interactions.
Absolutely, yeah. So these artworks aren't attempting to be mathematical, or mathematically correct elements.
No, but it's more philosophical also.
But yeah, and as I said, even the philosophy, I think Lyotard acknowledged that it was based on his rather limited understanding of what he called postmodern science. He didn't claim to be an expert on the uncertainty principle or anything like that. He took from it what he needed for his philosophy, I think. Yeah.
Just a remark, you're putting together the topic of scale and the topic of postmodernism made me think about the fact that actually before the 20th century, people believed in a kind of extreme scale relativity, in the idea that there could be a universe inside a grain of sand, right? And we think of the 20th century as the great era of relativity, but it actually imposed absolute scale on the universe, both at the small scale and at the large. And it also reminds me, in the early 20th century, there were a lot of fantasies about very small sounds, and then people wrote about, was there a sonic equivalent to the microscope? And again, there's an absolute scale for sound given by the Brownian motion of the air. And so there's a funny kind of way in which the 20th century gave us new forms of relativity and took away the old ones which actually pertain to scale. And I just thought that was a kind of interesting interaction of two of your themes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I've only ever focused on contemporary art in my work, but that's fascinating. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Yes, Andre?
You didn't mention Sarah, who was mentioned before. Is there some interesting things regarding not so much to size, but scale in Sarah?
I mean, it's interesting. In part, depends on what your definition of scale is, I suppose. And so, with the one I use in my book, it was a deliberately very specific definition that focused on proportional measurement in relation to a specific identifiable object. Really, so that's why I was looking at enlargement and miniaturization and life size. So Sarah's not kind of fit into my project in that respect. But certainly, and if you think of the more phenomenological aspect of scale, then Sarah's incredibly important. Yeah.
So, please.
Maybe it's a stupid remark, but what about Rodin and the different type of scales with his hands and free from anatomy? I don't know what you think about, and if there are other examples of this type of freedom from anatomy or intent of expressing something special with the hands.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose partly in terms of thinking through whether any scale change always kind of does prompt a question of meaning, of what either of the artist's intention or of something that the viewer can understand through the work. There's also lots of really interesting material about artists who scaled up or scaled down. It comes back to Elizabeth's discussion of the copy, I think, and the kind of facsimile, which is interesting. And Moore is very interesting in that respect as well. Henry Moore, in terms of his approach to scaling up and what he thought that could do and what it couldn't do. But again, Rodin's not someone I've looked into in detail. Thank you.
So, thank you very much.